Today, we're diving into a topic that has sparked intense debate across Europe and beyond. Denmark has made a decision that analysts, politicians, and ordinary citizens are calling a turning point, one that may reshape European politics, migration policy, and the regional balance of power for years to come. The ripples from this choice are already visible, and understanding why it is causing such disruption requires looking at both Denmark's internal political climate and the broader European context. So let's break it down clearly, step by step, and explore why this single decision is turning Europe upside down. Denmark has long been viewed as one of Europe's most stable, progressive, and socially cohesive countries. It's known for its welfare model, high trust in institutions, and strong democratic traditions. But in recent years, like much of Europe, Denmark has faced rising tensions around migration, security concerns, and cultural integration. These debates simmered for years, but they reached a boiling point when Denmark decided to implement a series of migration and asylum policies that are far stricter than almost any other EU member state. The moment these policies were announced, European leaders began warning that Denmark's approach could trigger a domino effect, pushing other countries to follow its lead and dramatically shifting Europe's political landscape. The core of Denmark's decision revolves around asylum processing. Danish leaders proposed a system where asylum seekers would no longer apply for protection inside Denmark. Instead, they would be transferred to partner countries outside Europe, often developing nations, to have their asylum claims processed there. Those granted refugee status would not return to Denmark, but would instead be resettled in the partner country. This essentially ends the traditional model of asylum within Danish borders. For many Europeans, this represents a fundamental challenge to decades of international refugee protocols. Supporters of the decision argue that Europe's asylum system is broken. They say it encourages dangerous journeys, enriches smugglers, and overwhelms frontline states. They also insist that the system rewards irregular migration instead of safe, legal resettlement. Denmark's leaders claim their model would deter human trafficking, reduce deaths at sea, and allow better control of who enters the country. From their perspective, this is not only a necessary policy shift, but a responsible one. However, critics say something very different. Many European leaders, human rights groups, and legal experts argue that Denmark's plan undermines international law and sets a dangerous precedent. If wealthy European countries begin outsourcing their asylum responsibilities, they warn the entire global refugee system could collapse. Developing nations may be pressured into hosting large numbers of asylum seekers in exchange for financial deals, reducing human beings to bargaining chips. The worry is that Europe could slowly abandon humanitarian obligations that have existed since World War II. The European Union finds itself in a difficult position. Denmark is technically part of the EU, but has an opt-out on justice and home affairs, meaning it doesn't follow the EU asylum rules. However, even with this opt-out, Denmark's policy still affects Europe because migration is a shared issue. If Denmark enforces stricter rules, asylum seekers may shift toward neighboring countries such as Germany or Sweden. This raises tensions at borders and increases pressure on other governments to adopt similar restrictive policies. The Danish decision has also emboldened political parties across Europe that have long pushed for tougher immigration controls. In countries like Italy, Austria, the Netherlands, and France, leaders are now citing Denmark as justification for their own proposals. This growing momentum could tip the balance of power in upcoming elections, giving more influence to parties that promote hardline immigration policies. For many analysts, Denmark's move is not an isolated event, but a catalyst for a continental realignment. One underlying factor behind this decision is demographic pressure. Denmark's population, like much of Europe, is aging rapidly. Economic models show that the country needs workers to sustain its welfare system. Yet many Danes are skeptical about integrating large numbers of newcomers. There are concerns about cultural cohesion, social trust, and the challenges of integrating communities that may have different values or limited education. This tension between economic need and cultural anxiety lies at the heart of the debate. The second major factor is security. Denmark, like its neighbors, has faced incidents of radicalization. Although the number of cases is relatively small, they have had a deep psychological impact on the population. Political leaders argue that tighter control over who enters the country is essential for national security. Critics say such fears are often exaggerated or exploited for political gain. Regardless, these concerns have shaped public opinion and influenced the decision-making process. One of the most controversial parts of Denmark's approach is the idea of relocating asylum seekers to countries such as Rwanda or other African partners. The very thought of outsourcing asylum has become symbolic of a much deeper shift, away from the idea of shared European solidarity and toward a more nationalized, self-contained model. Some fear this will encourage a system where rich nations pay poorer countries to absorb humanitarian responsibilities. Others see it as a practical solution to a long-standing problem. The truth is, the impact of such a system is still unknown because it has rarely been tried on a large scale. Another shockwave across Europe comes from the political messaging behind Denmark's decision. The Danish government emphasizes that this is not about isolation, but about reshaping migration at the global level. They argue that Europe needs new systems suited to modern realities, yet many observers note a growing trend. Even center-left governments in Europe are adopting policies that were once associated with far-right parties. This blurring of ideological lines has left many traditional voters confused and has opened space for populist movements to gain ground. Denmark's decision is also creating friction within the EU political institutions. Some officials worry that the Union may become divided between countries advocating for stricter control and those insisting on shared humanitarian responsibility. This divide is not only political, but moral. It raises difficult questions about what Europe stands for and whether it can maintain unity on issues as sensitive as human rights. Economically, Denmark's move could have ripple effects. If more countries tighten migration rules, labor shortages in industries such as agriculture, healthcare, and manufacturing may worsen. Businesses across Europe argue that migration is essential for economic growth. Some fear that stricter rules will push Europe into deeper demographic decline and limit its competitiveness on the global stage. However, others believe the opposite, that stricter controls will encourage investment in automation, local workforce development, and technological innovation. They argue that Europe can maintain economic strength without relying heavily on migration. This debate is likely to intensify as demographic trends continue. Social tensions are another major concern. Denmark's model may reshape public attitudes across Europe. Some communities may feel more empowered to demand tougher controls, while others may protest what they see as growing intolerance. These competing forces could widen generational, cultural, and political divides. Younger Europeans, who often favor more open border policies, may feel increasingly disconnected from governments moving in the opposite direction. Internationally, Denmark's decision has implications beyond Europe. Other countries, including Australia and the UK, have experimented with offshore asylum models. Some analysts fear a global trend toward outsourcing migration responsibilities. Others believe this could prompt the United Nations to rethink the international asylum system entirely, possibly leading to new frameworks or global agreements in the future. In Denmark itself, the decision has sparked intense debate. Some citizens feel proud that their country is taking bold action. They see it as leadership in a time when many governments are paralyzed by political fear. Others feel ashamed, arguing that Denmark is turning its back on its humanitarian traditions. The domestic conversation reflects a broader identity crisis. What does it mean to be Danish in a rapidly changing world? This identity question is one reason the decision resonates so strongly across Europe. Countries everywhere are grappling with the same issue. Globalization, migration, and technological change have transformed societies. Many Europeans feel uncertain about the future. Denmark's decision symbolizes a search for control in a world where control feels increasingly elusive. Another important element of this story is the media's role. The decision has been portrayed in vastly different ways depending on the outlet. Some present it as a courageous, necessary step toward a realistic migration system. Others depict it as a moral failure and a dangerous shift toward isolationism. This polarized narrative has amplified emotions and deepened divisions across the continent. Europe is also dealing with geopolitical pressures, conflict zones, climate change, and economic instability in regions like Africa and the Middle East. These factors are pushing more people to migrate. Denmark's policy is partly a response to these global forces, but critics say it also ignores the root causes of migration and focuses instead on deterrence rather than solutions. One reason Denmark's decision is turning Europe upside down is because it forces uncomfortable questions onto the political stage. Should countries prioritize their own stability over shared humanitarian responsibilities? Should asylum be processed inside safe countries or abroad? Can Europe maintain unity without a shared migration strategy? Should cultural preservation be considered a legitimate political concern? Or is it a cover for xenophobia? These questions were always present but often avoided. Denmark has brought them to the forefront. Another reason is timing. Europe is entering a period of rising nationalism, economic uncertainty, and heightened geopolitical tension. Decisions that might have caused mild debate 10 years ago now trigger intense reactions. The political climate is fragile, and Denmark's bold move acts like a spark in dry grass. It's also important to note that Denmark's policy, while controversial, taps into widespread feelings across Europe. Polls show that many Europeans are dissatisfied with the current migration system. They believe it is unpredictable, unfair, and vulnerable to exploitation. Denmark's leaders argue that they are simply responding to these concerns. But critics say governments should address the system's flaws without abandoning humanitarian values. Regardless of where one stands, it's clear that Denmark has shifted the conversation. European leaders are now forced to confront the possibility that the asylum system may need fundamental reform. Some may resist Denmark's approach, while others may embrace it, but ignoring it is no longer an option. The long-term consequences of Denmark's decision are still uncertain. It could reshape migration patterns, influence elections, shift alliances, and transform the EU legal framework. It could also redefine Europe's identity, forcing the continent to choose between competing visions of its future. Some analysts believe Denmark's decision will ultimately be remembered as the start of a new era, one where national sovereignty becomes more important than EU unity. Others think it will trigger backlash and motivate countries to defend traditional humanitarian principles. Europe has often swung like a pendulum between openness and restriction. Denmark's move may push the pendulum hard in one direction, but it remains to be seen where it will settle. What is clear is that Denmark has become a testing ground for ideas that were once considered too radical for mainstream politics. Its decision has revealed deep divisions not only between countries, but within societies themselves. And it has forced Europe to confront the reality that the world has changed and old systems may no longer be sustainable. As the debate continues, Europe stands at a crossroads. Will it move toward stricter controls and outsourced asylum policies? Or will it reassert a commitment to shared responsibility and humanitarian values? Denmark may not have all the answers, but it has certainly forced the continent to ask important questions, and that is why Denmark's decision is turning Europe upside down. Thank you for watching. If you found this explanation helpful, make sure to like, share, and stay tuned for more deep dives into major global developments.